Yeah, hi, everyone. This is Krishana Lloyd from Child Trends. We are having a few little technical difficulties that we hope to get resolved soon. So we will likely be starting in about 5 minutes or so. And in the meantime, we would love it if people who are joining us today would put their name and their organization in the chat. We'll have a little slideshow as people do that and we work out our technical difficulties, and then we'll get started shortly. Thank you so much. Right. All right. Thank you, folks, for hanging in with us while we had our little technical difficulties. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Krishana Lloyd. I am a clinical social worker turned researcher. My doctorate is in family studies, and I'll tell you why that's important in a while. And I'm from the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, or what we call the DMV area. I currently live in New Jersey. And I work for an organization called Child Trends. I am the principal investigator and the project lead for the Black Families Flourishing project. It is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded multi-year research effort, and it's focused on shedding light on the diversity, the strengths, and the cultural assets of Black families across the country. And we have some other things that we do too. We do some partnering, collaborating with mission aligned organizations. We support other organizations via technical assistance and training who are interested in using evidence to build their capacity to work in support of Black families. And we also work to help translate research to media and others to ensure that communication and narratives about Black families are expansive and also accurate. So over the next hour or so that we're here, we built in an extra 15 minutes as to a typical webinar, so that we have opportunity to discuss. I'm going to contribute to and also facilitate a conversation with this illustrious, all-star, academic famous panel that you have before you. And I'm going to introduce them in a short bit, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge the planning contributors and talk a little bit about the purpose and the goals of our discussion. So the people that really spent time helping us to plan for this are Alicia Hardy from the National Black Child Development Institute. She is also on the advisory board of Black Families Flourishing, or what we call BFF. Rhea Shelton, Sage Cabero Acosta, Lauren Whalens, Dr. Robert or Becky Verrett from Child Trends. These are all people who, in combination, have contributed brain power, technology skills, music, listening, recording, logistical, and coordination skills to ensure that this celebration, this celebratory meeting could occur, all while engaged in other projects and work. So I just want to say that we appreciate all of you. I also want to thank you all for joining our Juneteenth celebration. Time is valuable. You've chosen to be here, and we're really grateful that you're here and excited to engage. In terms of the purpose and the goals, so our panelists have been charged with drawing on their own work, the work of others, to share research-informed perspectives using history, present day, and forward-looking lenses. And you're going to hear me say research and evidence a lot. And as researchers, the panelist is full of researchers, all researchers, and also Black researchers. We are people who care and think a lot about Black families. It's incredibly important to us that conversations about Black families are grounded in rigorous and solid evidence. And within that, we'll also sprinkle in a little bit of experiences as Black people who have walked the United States for quite some time. And part of the impetus for this celebration is the nation's current context. In addition to celebrating the 5th anniversary of the federal recognition of Juneteenth as a national holiday, and I must say, that's an effort that was worked on tirelessly by my very own Zeta Phi Beta Incorporated soror, Dr. Opal Lee, really the mastermind and the catalyst for the holiday. We are also nearing the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, united. These dates should not be taken lightly, and they require reflection. The recognition of Juneteenth as a federal holiday, alongside our federal holiday that recognizes the contributions and the taken life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the country, commemorates national progress that's been made towards full recognition of the country's founding principles of liberty and justice for all. It also acknowledges the struggle for those principles to be enacted. And if we pull out a mirror, we as a country know that we are far from the reality of liberty and justice for all. Yet, in the spirit of optimism, of collectivism, and resistance, all empirically documented cultural strengths and assets in Black communities, Black families amazingly remain here, not exterminated, not vanished or disadvantaged in many different ways, and disadvantaged in some ways, and all of our beautiful diversity and complexity. So these milestones are important. They really provide the backdrop for what is and what we think about, or what we think is very necessary, given the country's current context and times. I also just want to acknowledge and note that we've read through all of the comments and the questions that were shared during the registration process, and we're really looking forward to hearing more from you during this conversation. We have an explicit goal on the Black Families Flourishing Project to support and mentor and usher in the next generation of family researchers, policy, and program leaders in the field. And in light of this, we want to give a special shout out to the Boston folks who are on the phone. There's a social work policy class here with their students and a professor who's joining us today. We hope the conversation is useful to you, that it stimulates your thinking and motivation about careers in research and policy and program spaces. So what are we going to do? What are we doing here today? We are focusing specifically on family. And we are the Black Families Flourishing Project. Panelists are going to be speaking to these issues. And I want to just share a little bit about how we define family. And we do that in terms of caretaking. So when we say caretaking, we mean a group of at least one self-identified Black adults and or Black child who is related by birth, marriage, adoption, or choice. You can see that's kind of a broad and expansive definition of family. Families must have children, and we understand and we recognize that this sometimes can be considered a hot button political issue right now. For the BFF Project and our work, which falls under, as I mentioned, an organization called Child Trends, we are heavily focused on children. So understanding what is happening with children vis-a-vis the adults and the systems that they engage in is important to us. So I just want to be clear, we're not making a political statement that families must have children, and we certainly do not disparage those that do not. We are simply saying that our focus and our perspective on the Black Families Flourishing Project is one on caretaking and is child driven. And also, when we say children, we're talking about individuals 0 to age 25. And this is a longer runway in terms of age than typical researchers use. And we made this conceptual decision based on empirical evidence as well as developmental and practical reasons based on the ways in which children are connected to families. Okay, so that's important to understand. And the research pieces I mentioned is also critically important. Everyone kind of has opinions and thoughts and perspectives about families in the country, what families should be doing, who's responsible for ensuring their well-being and flourishing, how this should happen. Our foundation or floor for this conversation really rests on the assumption that there's a responsibility, a civic responsibility to understanding how families flourish and also to supporting family flourishing. Just a few more things before we dive in. One, wanting to acknowledge on this foundation or floor that Black family life is inherently political and policy focused. Right. And this has been evident from the enslavement of Black people in the country. In fact, one of our very first policies in this country, partus sequitur ventrum, codified in my home state in Virginia in the 1600s, was a legal doctrine that meant that which is born follows the womb. Right. So established in colonial America, what it really meant was that a child's enslaved or free status was inherited directly from the mother. And this was a very distinct and American policy that overturned traditional English common law, which stated that the child's status followed the father. Right? So that is one of the first policies related to families in this country. Okay, very important to understand and recognize. Also, kind of the foundation on which we are resting is that the well-being of Black families is tied to the well-being of the nation. And we've seen how policy levers have been used to disadvantage and support Black family well-being. And so we want to acknowledge that and also acknowledge that we're starting from a standpoint that attention to systems change, systems more generally, rather than personal responsibility narratives alone in isolation is necessary to contribute conditions to family flourishing. So that's our floor. That's our foundation. And I want you to kind of just hold on to that and understand that as we begin our conversation. So our panelists here that we have, this illustrious panel includes Dr. Clinton Boyd, who's a sociologist and the executive director of Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities, and a national thought leader dedicated to advancing father engagement, strengthening families, and creating the conditions for children and communities to flourish. We also have, and I'm introducing in alphabetical order, Dr. Christina J. Cross, who is an associate professor of sociology at Harvard University and the author of an award-winning, recently released book, Inherited Inequality. I encourage you all to read it if you have not, which explores the benefits of marriage for children. We have Dr. William Sandy Darity, who's a visiting professor of economics at Howard University and a distinguished emeritus professor at Duke University. And we also have Dr. Dedrick Williams, who's a sociologist and associate professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And Dr. Williams' research, his interests really center around American racism, Black families, and quantitative methodologies. So you can see from this panel, as I mentioned, we are all Black, and like families across the country, we're a diverse group. We come from different generations, different geographic contexts, different family structures. We have different religious and spiritual beliefs, economic backgrounds. We have varied academic backgrounds and are trained in different disciplines. And we also work in different institutions, academia, we work government, nonprofits, philanthropic spaces, etc. Right? Some of us are married, some have children, older children, younger children, we're single, right? So a wide range of perspective and lived experience that we're bringing to the panel. But what we all are clear about is that we have a sincere desire to see Black families flourish in the country, and we also have an understanding of the country's history and how underlying systems can have a significant effect on Black families. So, with that, I'm going to get us started. And I'm going to kick off the first conversation really to ask a question about the legacies of systems and policies, and to understand what that means for Black families implicitly. So, if we think about kind of the implications of research and of policy and how they play out in Black family life, I'd like our panelists to speak a little bit to those issues. And so I'm going to start with Christina, and others can jump in as they see fit, and I will facilitate and move us along in this conversation and others as we emerge. And I will also encourage folks, if they have questions as we're going through and having a discussion, to put those in the chat. We have folks who are monitoring the chat, and we'll pass those questions on to us.
Well, thank you, Krishana, for inviting us all to be here today. Thank you for laying that foundation for us. It's truly a joy to just be in conversation with you all in celebration of Juneteenth, but also, of course, to have an open, honest conversation about the state of Black families and ways that we can devise strategies to better support them. Um, you asked about systems and policies that have affected Black families. And unfortunately, there are so many that we can point to, both historically and even present day, that have operated in ways that have made it difficult for Black families to care for their members. As a researcher who studies family structure and racial inequality, I think a lot about cash assistance programs and the legacy of exclusion of Black families with respect to cash assistance, in part because many of the sort of barriers to receiving assistance are connected to family structure. So, in some form of or another, government agencies have provided cash assistance to low-income families with children since the early 1900s. And pretty much since their inception, Black families have experienced barriers to accessing cash assistance, often through seemingly race-neutral policies and practices that have produced racially discriminatory outcomes. This began with mothers' pensions in the early 1900s. These were pensions that were provided to widows and on occasion to some poor single mothers whose husbands were institutionalized or had left the home for some reason. And during this time, some Southern states legally excluded Black mothers and children from receiving those benefits. States also who didn't legally exclude Black mothers from access, they often determined eligibility for assistance based on subjective assessments of a mother's moral character. And unfortunately and unsurprisingly, Black mothers were often judged to be of poorer character, rendering them ineligible for support. Now, that was sort of the first iteration of caste assistance or welfare in America, and that was at the state level. But in the 1930s, the federal government created a larger welfare system, Aid to Dependent Children, which was later referred to as Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And like the mother's pensions programs, Black families were excluded from AFDC via subjective judgments of their character, often related to their family structure. So there was something called a suitable home rule. And basically, this rule made poor families access to benefits contingent on whether their home was deemed quote unquote suitable. But how do you define suitability? Well, program administrators were given wide discretion in determining that. And often they looked at things like a woman's relationship status. If she was an unwed mother, she was denied access to benefits. But even if she was not an unwed mother, if there was an able-bodied man in the home, she could still be denied access to support, even if he was not in a position to support the children. And so this put Black families in an impossible situation. If Black women were married, but for whatever reason they were struggling financially, their household was, they could be denied access. But if they were unmarried, right, they could be considered unsuitable and still be denied access. So the best option was to just not be poor, which we know for many historical reasons was exceedingly difficult. But then bringing us to present day with our current welfare system, TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, this program, again, it doesn't have sort of racially specific it's not determining eligibility based on a person's racial or ethnic background, but in practice, it does produce racial discriminatory outcomes. And that's in large part through three of the four goals of TANF, which focus on family structure, particularly promoting the two-parent nuclear family, as a strategy to alleviate poverty. And TANF actually sets aside hundreds of millions of dollars every year on programming such as marital counseling or counseling about the importance of marital stability. There's even money set aside for advertising campaigns to promote the two-parent family. And there's been research to show by poverty scholar Zachary Perlin that a poor Black family seeking a financial assistance from TANF is actually more likely to be offered support via one of these marriage promotion activities than receiving direct financial assistance compared to poor white families. So throughout our history of cash assistance to low income families, we also see a history of exclusion based on subjective standards, often related to family structure. But we know that Black families take a variety of forms. There is not one family structure that is going to work for everyone. And at the same time, Black families are held to standards that make it exceedingly difficult for them to care for their members.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Very thorough and expansive answer. Are there others who would like to jump in?
I saw in the chat that someone asked Dr. Darity to jump in. Is that true? I don't want to jump in without permission.
Okay, well, under that incentive, I will jump in. Um, I think that there actually are three questions, and I think the first one was answered in very rich fashion by Dr. Lloyd. The first question is, what is a family? The second is, what factors determine racial differences in family structure? And the third is, how do differences in family structure affect child and community outcomes? And I think that there is a narrative that's been very persistent and pervasive, that a particular structure of family, a family that does not conform to the norms of the nuclear two-parent family, typically two children, that families that have other types of structures do not have positive effects on child development and on the conditions or characteristics of the communities where those families live. So it's not so much a question of the vanishing of families, but it is a question of the vanishing of particular family types. And there's a privileging of a particular type as being the most socially useful. And again, that's the two-parent family with approximately two children. So that's what appears to be absent in the Black community, uh, to a much larger extent than it's absent in the white community. Although there is a decline in the presence of two-parent families in the white community also. Uh, so that leads to the second question as to what accounts for this. And I think that there's a long tradition of scholarship, a somewhat disturbing long tradition of scholarship that makes the claim that these differences are due to some kind of holdover effect from slavery, or they are attributable to some kind of cultural predisposition towards having a different type of family structure that is ultimately socially dysfunctional. Uh, but there's also a strand of literature, and I think that this is what's very, very much emphasized in Dr. Cross's work, which says that there's a socioeconomic structure that tends to mitigate against black families having the same types of characteristics as most white families. And this is inclusive of anti-black racism. Even Daniel Moynihan, who shared this perspective that there was some kind of hangover effect from the disintegrative effects of slavery on black families, that even he said that the higher degree of unemployment that was faced by black men was a contributing factor to the absence of the same number of two-parent families. And I think that now we hear from the latest advocate of this perspective, Delano Squires, saying, well, look, the poverty rate for Black Americans has fallen, but the presence of two-parent Black families has also declined at the same time. And so this must rule out the socioeconomic factors as being significant. And I think that that's why, in part, Dr. Cross's work is so important, because I think it's a direct confrontation with that point of view. But I would also like to add something very simple here, and then I'll stop for the moment. And that is the relationship between the poverty rate and family structure is what we like to call a simple correlation that doesn't necessarily tell us much about causation. And I would like to propose that if we're going to make those kinds of simple correlations, that instead of using the poverty rate, let's use the black-white difference in wealth, which has explosively grown in terms of sheer dollar value adjusted for inflation from the end of the Civil War to the present. And it has grown to such extent that the household gap in wealth between the average black and white household as of 2022 was $1.15 million. And so if we wanted to make a simple correlation, we could say that the presence of two-parent black families has declined as the racial wealth gap has exploded.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Um, Dr. Boyd Clinton, I'd like
Yeah.
to ask you to chat with us a little bit about, because one of the things we hear, right, and we talk about a lot when we talk about Black families, and Moynihan was mentioned and others, is, this very kind of female focused home. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your work and your work on fathers specifically, and how you think about that in relationship to some of what Dr. Darity just talked about in terms of income, wealth gaps, access. You have any thoughts about that, and specifically around Black fathers and roles in families and
Oh,
supporting
yeah.
flourishing?
Yeah, no, I have a lot of thoughts about this. And so
Okay.
I'm glad that I could just be numbered among you all today to engage in this very important conversation at a very critical time in our nation's history. And one of the things that I do feel deserves to be lifted up is when we think about, again, how the legacies and of the systems and the policies that have ignored and intentionally harmed Black families are reflected in the present. It's not just about those disparities being measured in terms of like poverty rates, incarceration, housing instability, or thinking about a lot of Sandy's work, the racial wealth gap. Like those are outcomes that we need to focus on. But to me, the deeper legacy is really this like this narrative injustice or this presumption of deficiency that is deeply embedded in like this deeply embedded belief that operates within America's policies, institutions, and even the public discourse that oftentimes views Black families, Black fathers, especially in the case of my work, as inherently lacking, problematic or in need of correction rather than being a source of strength, resilience, or possibility. And so to me, I think that is something that has to be lifted up explicitly in the context of this work because it has so many implications for the work that I do around Black fathers, because for generations, policy that they didn't just restrict opportunity, they constructed a narrative and a narrative that Black fathers were absent rather than obstructed is something that I've oftentimes had to confront in the context of my work. And even when I think about the more the Moynihan report, right? While, as Sandy alluded to, the report definitely acknowledged like racism and economic exclusion, it also talked about or ultimately helped shift this whole public discourse towards viewing the Black family structure, particularly the absence of fathers, as a central explanation for racial inequality in this country, right? And then over time, you have policymakers who increasingly focused on absent fathers as the problem rather than asking what are those economic, labor market, housing, educational, and criminal justice policies that were erected that helped to destabilize families in the first place. And so when you look at a lot of the policy shifts that occurred specifically in the child support arena, around the 80s and 90s, that's when we really saw this public narrative being crafted around the deadbeat dad. And this image of like an irresponsible father was it was politicized, right? And oftentimes it was racialized in public imagination and it was disproportionately applied to Black fathers. And so it's really that term deadbeat dad became this code or stand-in for the stereotypes about poor Black fathers. And it's that narrative that we're fighting against, although countless research and scholarship has debunked that myth about the contributions that Black fathers play in the roles of our families and our communities. And despite that evidence being present, it's still oftentimes it's the case that it's easier for folks to cling to the lie because the lies allow systems to avoid accountability for the harm that they produce. And it's a lot easier to fault an individual than to go after an entire system that is producing the conditions that our families and the fathers in my work are ultimately responding to. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. See a lot of hearts. So some agreement among the attendees with your statement. I'm curious, one of the things um, that was mentioned kind of implicitly and I think explicitly in some of the conversation that we've had so far, um, and even in some of the framing that I did, is that there's somewhat of an expansive definition of family for Black people. And that has been a cultural asset and has happened, kind of historically. And I think, even of my own life and the people who played a really big role was not only, my mother and father, there were grandmothers, there were aunties, there were family friends, there were places that I went in the summer, right, and spent time. And so family more generally, I think for Black folks, and even others, when we think about kind of other races and ethnicities, is quite broader than just a simple nuclear family, which is one of the reasons why we've kind of adopted this caretaking, kind of broader focus of family and what that means. But so I'm thinking about this just in terms of policies and systems and the way that our systems have been formulated and thought about and operationalized in the country. And I'm curious whether anyone wants to speak a little bit to this kind of expansive definition of family that I think people live, and what happens in systems and policy spaces that doesn't necessarily align, I think, with that definition or how people are, moving about in their day to day. Dedrick, would you like to take that on, Dr. Williams?
Sure, sure. I appreciate the space to share here and with the panelists who have already have uttered some really, really amazing points to this. I would like to start by saying that my response to this is really rooted in some scholars' work that I find really, really powerful. That's Tara Hunter's work, who's at Princeton. Also, Robin Langhart, who's at Georgetown Law. There's been historians and legal scholars who have been talking about this for some time. I think sociology as an academic discipline has been slow on really kind of grappling with this particular set of ideas, largely for several reasons. But the reason I pull on these scholars' work is that they are questioning the idea of marriage as a kind of universal family form to begin with. Like, why is it among people who are racialized as Black, why is marriage the kind of thing that trips over? Why is marriage the presumed mechanism for all of Black folks' inequality, right? And so there's a historical and legal reason for that, and it's inextricably linked to how we understand policy. So the idea that marriage is a universal comes out of a kind of Eurocentric universalism model, right? So how can people who were formerly enslaved become free and start families? And so marriage became this idea to shift. In many ways, they argue, my work also make the argument that the state shifted responsibility away from itself to individuals, right? So slavery as an institution we know in the United States is at the state level. I mean, there's still contemporary debates on whether or not the Civil War was over slavery or not, right? Or state rights. And so because of the state shifting responsibility away from the state itself to individuals, marriage becomes this kind of shiny box, the shiny idea, if you will, for people who were previously enslaved to be free persons. So they have a ton of scholars who have written about marriage as citizenship, particularly marriage as Black citizenship at the end of the Civil War. So marriage had become this idea that there's only one particular way of life for this idea called families. But the irony here, the somewhat of an irony here, is that people racialized as Black had different family forms before they were legally able to marry and that marriage be recognized by the state itself. So you're asking people who have left a historically oppressive institution called slavery and asking these women who are racialized as Black to enter another state-sanctioned oppressive institution called marriage, and in terms of patriarchy as an oppressive system, to do something that is perceived as different, but many people who experience the institution see it as one and the same thing. This is not to say that women racialized as Black did not get married. What these scholars and myself argue is that women racialized as Black had a plethora of ways of doing family, familial relationships, and the idea that one gives over their sense of self to a man in relation to an institution they just left is makes sense. So again, using a kind of Eurocentric framework to people racialized as Black who has a distinct set of histories and experiences is not only short-sighted, but it in and of itself is an oppressive understanding, or an oppressive way of understanding family life, because you're asking people to do something or assuming people should do something in which their history does not allow it to be normalized in the same way. Again, I am not saying that people racialized as Black did not get married, especially after the Civil War. I'm saying that there were many different family forms. And so because people racialized as white are disproportionately represented in marriage, then this becomes a kind of segue to understanding Black life vis-a-vis white life. And that not only is that problematic, but it leads to the idea that there's one size fits all policies. And I think that's what ends up happening, is that the lived experience based on history and contemporary kind of happenings, it becomes a challenge for people to accept policy or to pass policy that doesn't align with people's real experiences. And so I think we have to kind of step back for a second and ask ourselves, why is it among the many people that exist in the United States, why is it that people racialize as Black when they're facing inequities, that the default setting is family formations, the lack of marriage, rise in quote unquote single family households. And I think we have to call that idea into question, largely because we have to understand that as history varies, so does the policies to ameliorate the inequality. It also has to vary. And if we don't do that and do that effective enough, then we'll be still singing the same song that we've been singing forever and a day. We're still, I always joke about this, that in the year of our Lord 2026, we're still having these types of conversations, given the many scholars who have written about this for a long, long time. And so I think there's a disconnect between reality or lived experiences and those who are passing the policies are often shaped by their own set of experiences. And these things tend to be incongruent in those particular patterns. So I'm gonna stop there and just adding to the conversation with the other panelists.
Thank you, Dedrick. It's really kind of starting and questioning even kind of the idea of why we're talking about particular things, much less kind of the outcomes. But I do want to move us a little bit to this question about outcomes. And Sandy mentioned this a little bit, some of Christina's work. And I'm not sure if everybody who is on the call is familiar with it, but Christina, I would love for you to talk a little bit about your work, your book, your findings, really about as we think about these assumptions around benefits of marriage and what it brings to the table for families. If you could share a little bit about what you found in your work.
Definitely. So first, I want to acknowledge, we're having this conversation about marriage, about family structure, and racial inequality. And the goal here is to make very clear that family structure in and of itself does not explain racial inequality, and outcomes across groups. And that has been sort of a key argument for over 60 years now to account for, much higher rates of poverty among Black Americans, lower rates of educational attainment, and just other indicators of people's life chances. And so in my book, Inherited Inequality, I actually take seriously that explanation, that argument that, if Black people simply had the quote unquote right family structure, that many of these disadvantages that they experience would go away. In my book, my question isn't whether marriage is a good or bad thing. It's up to each person to decide for themselves the right family structure for them. But my question is, okay, when Black children grow up in stable two-parent families, how do they fare? How do their outcomes look compared to their white peers? Is the two-parent family this great equalizer that so many Americans, so many policymakers, so many folks who are, in media, just everyday people imagine it to be? And what I found is that even when Black children grow up in stable two-parent families, their outcomes differ drastically from their white peers. They're 2 to 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school. They end up earning a fraction of the income and even smaller, accumulate even a smaller fraction of the wealth of their white peers who grow up in the two-parent family. So this will likely not come as a surprise to many folks, but no, the two-parent family is not this great equalizer. I think it's important to carefully document that and of course to help explain why that is the case. And one of the reasons why I think it's also important to document it is actually because Black two-parent families on the rise. We're having this many conversations about sort of the breakdown of Black families, how they're vanishing, but we actually see a rise over the past decade, about a 15% increase in Black two-parent families. And for every Black child who's living apart from a parent, there's a Black child who's growing up with both their parents, right? And so if Black two-parent families are on the rise, but this inequality exists, then we have to be concerned that it will be perpetuated even, right, as this family structure potentially grows. And what are we going to do about that? In my book, one of the things I find is that the largest sort of predictor of the gap, one of the key explanations for the gap in children's outcomes is actually gaps in families' economic resources. I'm talking income, I'm talking poverty risk, I'm talking wealth, as our colleague Sandy Darity can talk to you about even better than I can, and how these things not only make it more difficult for Black families to get together and stay together if they want to, but also it undermines children's opportunities as they grow up in a variety of ways. And so, as we think about what is sort of the ideal family structure, we need to be cognizant of the fact that even in the sort of ideal arrangement, Black children are placed at a disadvantage. So, it cannot be this family structure in and of itself that is driving racial inequality.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the a question from the audience, from the attendees. And so one of the questions I think you answered, but let me get to the other one, which is really around all things being equal, is a two-parent home kind of the best structure for raising children? And if yes, should more be done by Black leaders to promote it?
Thank you for that question. So to answer it, you have to think about, okay, what does best mean? I think what we're asking here is that does it cause sort of the better outcomes? What I found in my research is that Black children who lived with both parents, they did tend to have higher outcomes than their peers who lived apart from a parent. But was it family structure itself that was causing these improved outcomes, or was it some of the very advantages that Black children who grew up with two parents already had access to? That's been sort of the puzzle that researchers have been trying to disentangle for decades. Is it family structure, or is it that couples who get married and stay married tend to be more advantaged? Well, my scholarship and the scholarship of many other researchers has shown that in general, there's a lot of selection here. Uh, Black couples who are able to enter into marriage tend to be more highly educated. They tend to have higher incomes. They're advantaged in a number of other realms of life. And so when you ask, is it the best family structure? I think that we are actually asking the wrong question. It's about, is it, family structure that's causing it? And Sandy was just talking about correlation versus causation earlier, and that's what we're seeing here, a large correlation. One of the things that I found is that Black children who grew up in two-parent families, they did have improved outcomes relative to Black children who lived apart from a parent, but their outcomes were actually, in many cases, the same as white children who grew up with a single parent. That is a substantial gap. We should not be okay with accepting less for Black children and that they should have to get the same outcomes with two parents that white children experience with one. So, a singular focus on promoting the two-parent family is not going to get us there. Even if you see improved outcomes that are associated with living in a two-parent family, we need to be asking why these gaps still exist and what else can we be doing, because that is not going to be enough and we can't accept less for Black children.
Yeah, I'd like to return
Thank
to my
you.
pet concern, which is the wealth gap, uh, and to reinforce what Christina Cross just said. A um, a, a single parent white family typically has a net worth that is twice the net worth of a two-parent Black family. And the significance of that is because wealth is decisive in shaping family security, opportunity, and well-being. And to the extent that we have these kinds of wealth differentials in previous generations, that get transmitted to the the current adult generation, we have a situation in which it's actually wealth that could be driving family structure rather than vice versa. And that's really, really important. I'd also add that it's not the case that in every society in the world that children who come from two-parent families necessarily have better life outcomes than children who come from single-parent families. In fact, if we look at countries like Sweden, Germany, and Austria, we find that there's absolutely no difference in outcomes between kids in single parent and two parent families. And so the social context and the policy context of a particular country is really, really important in determining whether or not family structure matters at all, even in the absence of consideration of race, of racial inequality.
Thank you, Sandy. Um, I'm cognizant of time. I knew we needed more time for this one. Never enough time. That just means we have to have another discussion and celebration. But I want to, with our 5 minutes that we have left, 4 minutes now, do a little forward thinking. Um, and, as we near this 250th anniversary of the experiment of our country, quite amazing here, 250 years, and we're seeing a rolling back of lots of rights and policies that have really historically, we know, have disadvantaged families, and in particular, Black families. I'm curious if people could just in 30 seconds or less, given the time, speak a little bit to what you think the remedies and the solutions are. What will really kind of propel and support Black family flourishing as we move into the next 250 years? I know, big question. I'm going to start with Clinton, and then we just work our way around.
Yeah, so for me, as someone who leads a community-based organization, I oftentimes find myself thinking a lot about the relationship between knowledge and action. And I think one of the greatest misconceptions about Black social movements in this country is that they were driven solely by passion and protest. But in reality, they were also driven by the ideas that were provided by some of our towering Black intellectuals during that day. And I just think because of the moment that we find ourselves in currently, it's just going to be very important for the Black intellectuals, such as the ones that are on this call and the ones that are also in other elite and non-elite academic institutions, continue to provide those ideas, the analysis, and like the intellectual frameworks that somebody like myself can use on the ground at fathers, families, and healthy communities as I'm thinking about how to develop community-based agendas
Mm.
and think about what our organizing and mobilization efforts need to be as we advance this work. Because, again, oftentimes I like to tell folks that research alone won't change lives, especially if those thoughts and ideas remain in policy reports and books. We have to find ways to take what folks are writing about and translate it into what's happening in community. And oftentimes, the community organizations have been those anchor institutions within our communities. And so I just feel like we need to have deeper collaboration among one another.
Thank you. I'm going to, and just let me just say one thing. I know we have a few more minutes. We may just go a little tad bit over. So if people can hang if they want to, that's fine. Because I want to give each panelist time to discuss. And also know that we have a resource list of lots of the things that people have discussed about, the research that people have referenced, we will send around. So you will have access to that. Also noting people say we need more panels and more discussions. I got it. Yes, please. We will work on that. So I'm going to pass it on to Dedrick, then Christina, and then I'll have Sandy bring us home and wrap us up. How does that sound to everybody? Okay, Dedrick.
Awesome. So one of the things that I struggle with, even as an academic, is, and Dr. Boyd mentioned this earlier about narratives. One of the things that I struggle with is helping people to understand what racism is and what racism ain't. And so there is this disconnect to believe that racism is some type of individual level act, that egregious act that one person does to another person, when many people understand, many scholars, including myself, understand racism as a system that make the ideal of race possible. So there is this, so when the assumption is that racial groups exist as if it's ontologically real, that it's real biologically or culturally, and then racism is then an outcome between two races or two or more races. That's erroneous thinking, and that thinking is, I think, is has led many academic debates, have led to frustration among many folks. And so I think that even with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, I think comes out of this idea that racism as an individual level egregious act is no longer a thing, and thus we don't need certain elements of the Voting Rights Act. And that disconnect is why marriage is often seen as a mechanism to ameliorate inequality rather than larger system policies, laws, and social practices. It's become convenient to place blame on the individual groups themselves, because we saw this during the slavery era with chattel slavery, the assumption that people racialized as black are inherently biologically inferior. So slavery is a byproduct of your doing, right? Or the lack of kind of humanity that people racialized as black have. So what I'm saying is, to Dr. Boyd's point, yes, there's this need for academics and community orgs to work in tandem and talking about these types of things. But there is something that I think is understated, is that when we talk about racism, race, and racial inequality, we're not talking about the same things. We're not coming from the same point of departure, and we're not making the same set of assumptions about what racism and race are. So until we have a good understanding what those things are, then we can have better conversations in terms of solutions, policies, social practice, etc. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Christina.
So, I know that I won't be able to do this question justice with the time we have remaining.
30 seconds.
Right. It's just, in order to address the various structural barriers that Black families have experienced for centuries in this country, is going to require a systems level, multi-pronged approach. I mean, from thinking about what I mentioned earlier in terms of like cash assistance programs and barriers to access to critical financial resources. But you also have to be thinking about mass incarceration and its role in like literally removing disproportionately Black men from homes, right? You have to be thinking about the education system, right? And how even today, many Black children do not have access to the high quality education that they need in order to be upwardly mobile. In my book, Inherited Inequality, we talked a little bit about it. I'll just lift it up here. Well, you can't see because of my background. But I spent an entire chapter sort of thinking through some of these key sectors of society. And so I just want to flag that because I know I won't be able to do it justice. But I will say that, one of the largest sort of explanations that I found for the gap amongst Black and white children from two-parent families, right? Ideal situation is the disparity in economic resources. And I know that Sandy can speak to this, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is actually this this recommendation for baby bonds, among other things. And so I'll end here, but just want to flag that as like a really important strategy to consider.
Thank you. Also a baby bonds fan here, working on an evaluation of it. Just want to note too for folks, I see there's questions, still additional questions in the chat. As we can and we send out the materials from the webinar, we will also do our best to address some of the questions. I know time was short. So Sandy, I'm going to give it to you to bring us home.
Okay. I think our thinking across the four of us is quite compatible and consistent. Uh, I would add to the baby bonds proposal, which I think would have a moderate effect on the racial wealth gap,
Mhm.
an explicit program that would be designed to eliminate the racial wealth gap altogether. I've tended with my work with Kirsten Mullen to say that that's what a reparations plan ought to look like. Um, if we had a program that eliminated the racial wealth gap by raising the average Black level of wealth to the average white level of wealth, I don't really care whether you call it reparations or something else, as long as we do it. And I think that, the work that Clinton is doing is quite remarkable. But I think he would probably agree that he's pushing against the mountain, and we need to level the mountain. And the way we can level the mountain is by bringing about a condition where Black Americans have the same material conditions for full citizenship that white Americans possess. And then the last comment I'd like to make is related to Diedrich's observation about the political climate. We are living in a society in which the consolidation of minority rule is becoming more and more intense. And it's not accurate. It really hasn't ever been accurate to describe the United States as a democracy. But there are degrees of democratness. And our degree is getting lower and lower and lower. And so the other part of this is to facilitate the kinds of policies that would really, really alter conditions in a positive way. We have to change who is in charge of our government. And, uh, and that requires a fight against a structure, a constitutional structure now, which ensures that 30% of the population controls the lives of the remaining 70%.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say thank you to the attendees. Again, acknowledge the time was too short. And we will rethink the next one and maybe see if we can get a little bit more time. We've also, so people know, I've been having some discussions about maybe pulling some of these learnings into a written product, perhaps, talking at a conference or other venues. So do know that we are thinking about how to extend the conversation so that it's not just this one shot. Really appreciate everyone. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the week and has a fantabulous Juneteenth on Friday and are doing things to continue to celebrate throughout the week. We wanted to kick it off. I think we kicked it off well, and we'll continue to celebrate the rest of the week and to keep Black Family Flourishing at the top of our minds in our work. And the work that we do here on the panel. And I know that you all will in the other spaces that you're in. So appreciate the time. Thank you so much to everyone.